Now, we would love to take some questions from the audience, and if I could have all of our 4 speakers join the table. Your seats are there. And if we have any of the index cards, perhaps some of our volunteers who are collecting the cards. Very good. We have some cards heading this way. Of course, we'd like to invite all of you to join us as well after the Q&A for a reception right outside the atrium. So we hope you join us as well. You can meet the speakers in a more of a one-on-one, and you can speak to them more in depth. Well, thank you very much. Oh, very good. Dr. Christakis, first question is, how do you determine whether people are happy or sad? Can't be very easy.
I have a pensive that I got from Harry Potter. There are a variety of tools that have been developed by other scientists, psychologists, that purport to measure, I think, reliably emotional states, and we just use those existing tools. In that particular study, we had a kind of psychometric scale where people answered a set of questions, and then they could be grouped into sad and happy categories. Some of the other outcomes I mentioned are a little bit easier to measure. The altruism game, you actually give people real money and see whether they give it to other individuals. In the Hadza, one of the ways we measured the ties is we gave people honey sticks, which the Hadza love, and we told them that you cannot keep this for yourself. You must give it anonymously to other members of your group, and saw what they did. So we have different kinds of objective and subjective measures.
For Dr. Tinetti, did you ask the patients their preferences for maintaining function, minimizing symptoms, and prolonging life more than once? And if so, were their preferences stable?
That's an excellent question, and much of that work actually was Dr. Freed, who I think had to leave. And the answer to that is yes. As people change in their health trajectories, very often their preferences do change over time. So I think one of the things that she's attempting to do, are there particular traits that do maintain? So in general, do people focus on one thing rather than another? But there are also certain kind of states that of preference that will change as people's condition change. And that's really been shown very much, particularly function, is young and healthy people think if I can't run a marathon, it's not worth living, right? Mm-hmm. And certainly as people become more and more ill and more functional, or less and less functional, what's important to them does change. And that is really certainly one of the challenges if we're going to use this in decision making, is that as preferences change, certainly decision making needs to change, and that certainly is a level of complexity that we still need to deal with.
Very good. And Dr. Strittmatter, question. I have read that only 2 activities can slow down Alzheimer's. One, exercise. The other one is meditation. Can you comment on that?
There may be many activities that could slow down Alzheimer's. I guess the question is, which ones have been proven in a scientifically acceptable sense? I think there's certainly very positive evidence that both exercise and mental activity can make a difference. Whether one type of activity versus a different is superior, I don't think there's enough head-to-head evidence to say I recommend meditation as compared to some other kind of playing a card game or working or doing any other kind of activity. So that's not been tested in the same kind of rigorous way.
I know that.
But I think being active, both mentally and physically, is unquestionably beneficial and strongly to be encouraged.
Absolutely. Using the brain function will help slow down, perhaps, the process of Alzheimer's or dementia. We've seen studies regarding that.
I think that certainly would be the recommendation. Exactly how much it slows down and how far we can go with that, we can't say today.
Still have to learn more about it. Okay. Dr. Chang, this person says, is asking, short telomere causes aging or cancers. How about increasing its length by technology? The lengths of should be, hold on, I just want to make sure, is that the length of telomere should be the same length in all cells? Should they be the same length in all cells?
I'm not sure what technology the writer is referring to, but the only way to increase telomere length that I know of is through the addition of telomerase. So if you add telomerase to, for example, stem cells, it will rescue the shortest telomere. So the shortest telomeres are the ones that cause the cellular senescence, premature aging phenotypes. But if you add telomerase, that short telomere is elongated and it no longer triggers the DNA damage response. So I think that's the only way that we know right now to add telomere length. Although there are certain studies that are not, I don't necessarily believe in it. Some small molecules may augment telomerase activity. I think that requires a lot of clinical trials.
So the lengths of, what about the lengths of the telomere? Should they be all the same length in all the cells?
It's only the shortest telomeres that we worry about. So studies have shown that one short telomere can actually initiate the cellular senescence mechanism. So you don't have to have all your telomeres to be elongated, but you just have to rescue that one short telomere that could trigger the DNA damage response.
Simply said, but difficult to do.
Very difficult.
Yes. Okay, Dr. Christakis. About social contagious phenomena. Do you think the media or propaganda have significant effect?
And inducing.
In inducing the effect?
Yeah.
Okay. In inducing the effect.
I would make a distinction between broadcast mechanisms and these types of social contagions. So Oprah Winfrey obviously has much more power than I do to affect what people do in this country, but she does that via broadcast mechanisms. Oprah actually probably does not have more power, any more or less power than I do to affect her personal friends. So Oprah probably has about as many real friends as I do, and when she recommends a movie to them or a recipe, she probably has about as much, well, maybe not a recipe, but about as much effect as I do. So it's the difference, and I'm often asked this question in the setting of obesity, how can it be that we are gaining weight even though our ideals about appropriate bodies have remained relatively constant? And the answer to that question is that you are much more affected by what your friends are doing than you are affected by what abstract individuals are doing. It's the same thing that leads prison guards to abuse prisoners. They have the ideal that we shouldn't do this, but when their peers are abusing the prisoners, they copy them. And so this is a widespread phenomenon in social system. Both are important. The ideal and the broadcast message are important, but the peer effects are so much more powerful than the broadcast mechanism.
Very good.
One for the entire panel at the top.
Okay, this is for all of you. How do we increase the likelihood that policies change as a result of lessons learned from research?
Dr. Chang.
I don't really understand the question.
I mean, I think there's a saying I was recently told that has really stuck with me, which is that you cannot reason a man out of an opinion he hasn't been reasoned into. And I think that the quality of our public discourse about science has declined. And I think it's very difficult to use reason to persuade people that the kinds of that policy should be based on rational grounds. So, and actually, many would argue that's not necessarily necessary. I mean, some people would say, what makes you think that evidence should be the guide to policy? You know, maybe the guide to policy should be some, God-given ideals, for example, or some abstract principles. The truth, of course, is both, because if you set policy without evidence, eventually you hit reality, and the policy doesn't work. But that doesn't mean principles are unimportant. And I think there was a time in our society, I mean, even I can remember it, I'm not that old, where we had a more, a greater respect for the meaning of evidence in formulating policy. And how to increase that, I don't know. Maybe one of my peers here has some ideas.
Anybody else?
I guess I would maybe distinguish between lessons learned and incorporated by policymakers or incorporated by society at large. I think there's a huge benefit towards society at large recognizing more about the science and the medicine of aspects of aging. The more that the general population knows about things that happen, as discussed in this kind of symposium or other forums, I think the more public policy, political opinion will be somewhat more informed. I believe, I'm not going to give that up in an institution of higher learning, that the more we can spread knowledge, the more informed society will be and the more lessons will translate into policy. Maybe that's overly hopeful, but I have to believe that anyway.
I'm with you.
Well, we've seen the impact of people getting behind the research for breast cancer. Because it is such an emotional issue for families and for women, funding has increased because of this. And because funding has increased, research has moved everything forward for women. And so perhaps with the aging issue, that if we arm people with more information, that they'll get behind this as more of us live longer. Especially when it comes to Alzheimer's, we're saying one case comes up every 7 seconds. That should be something that we should all be concerned about.
Well, I think there's growing concern, awareness of frequently reported, on the front pages of newspapers. It's gaining more in awareness. I think what may not have reached the general public is the idea that science may be the solution to the problems, that we're all kind of beginning to recognize more and more that the aging population and Alzheimer's disease are a growing problem, a massive problem. What's our way out of it? Maybe science is the way out of it. Maybe the NIA, maybe finding out more and discovering more is our only solution.
But we need more money, though, to do that, right?
Well, I think that, we also need wisdom and good experiments and wise use of the money there is.
Funding.
It's not
Exactly.
purely a money problem, but of course that matters.
Absolutely. Anybody else would like to jump in on that?
I think just, I think your question about the aging, people recognize it is the most important health condition in this country. People rally emotionally around individual diseases, such as breast cancer. It's a very good example. In fact, we had grand rounds this morning showing that the potential downside consequences of it being emotionally driven approach, that if anything, and breast cancer research is very, very important, but it's the proportion of resources that go into breast cancer really are out of proportion somewhat to some, not necessarily at the expense, because it's not a zero-sum game, but there are certain conditions that are easier to rally emotions around, and I think a lot of this is emotion-driven, and certainly those of us in aging have really tried to do exactly what you've talked about, is trying to get people to be aware and to focus and put some resources into understanding aging. And it's been complex. A lot of good minds have tried to do it, and I think it's an important thing, but I think we haven't yet gotten there in terms of how to resonate it the way we should.
Dr. Tonetti, this question is for you. My mother is on 12 different medications. Can I do anything now to help? What can we do for her?
Well, I think the most important thing is to have a good discussion with her doctor, and unfortunately, if she's on 12 medicines, she probably has 5 or 6 doctors as well. But the most important thing is to find out from her mother what's most important to her, and then to talk to her doctor and saying, this is what's important to my mother, which of these medications are most likely to help, and are any of them hurting for what's most important to her. And that's really as good as we can do right now, because we really don't have the research and the evidence to say for each individual person, this is definitely what's right for you, this is definitely what's right for you. But I think at least we can start that dialogue of at least heightening everybody's awareness of this medication. Is it going to influence the outcome that's most important to me? And that's the dialogue that we should be having increasingly with our physicians.
So the person who has his mother needs to talk to all her physicians, perhaps, because the mom may not be able to do so.
Right, or even more importantly, what we advocate is that this person and her mother identify who should be the primary physician making the decision, and really make it clear to the network of physicians, to use Dr. Kras's work, is that there is a network of physicians, is really identify one of them who is the decision maker and really feed all, and rather than 7 doctors making suggestions, is they all should make the suggestion to the one doctor who weighs all of it. That's the ideal world. It's not the way medicine practices, but it's the direction we're trying to move
Again,
towards.
we're talking about patient-centered care here.
It's patient-centered care. We all agree on it. Who can disagree with it, right? It's like apple pie, but how do you make it happen?
Okay. Dr. Christakis, can your network analysis distinguish benefits of connections between ages?
You mean mixed
It says,
generation?
I'll go on here, it says, evolution tells us often that reproduction, is that correct?
We are no longer useful.
We are no longer useful, but many of us appreciate the wisdom of our elders.
I see. Actually, I have just two things to say about that. First is a very trivial observation that humans evince homophily on age. That is to say, young people hang out with young people and older people with older people, and this is like anything else that humans do. So there is age segregation within these social fabrics. That's not too surprising. And there's another body of work, which is not our work. Other people have done work on the benefits of grandparents. In fact, one of the theories as to why we live so long, evolutionary biologists are taking this increasingly seriously, is that actually our survival after we reproduce and our own children reach adulthood beyond that is precisely because it confers fitness advantages to the next generation. And this, in a modern setting, this could include everything from wealth transmission to wisdom transmission and so forth. And actually, you see this in elephants too, which is very interesting. Elderly elephants, herds that are led by older elephants fare much better in times of drought than herds that are led by younger matriarchs. So there's a lot of convergent evidence from evolutionary biology that helps shed light on what the role of aged individuals within the population is, and helps to explain why there's some particularly long-lived species where it's hard on first principles to understand what would be the benefit to living to be 70. Incidentally, even hunter-gatherer, the survival was much shorter in bygone era, but that was primarily due to infant mortality. Conditional on surviving to 5 years, we have lengthened survival in humans over the last 100 years, but not as much as you would think.
And we have one last question, is that right? Okay. And this will be to Dr. Chang.
No, that's for Dr.
Oh,
So that's Dr. Christakis.
oh, it is Dr. Christakis. Okay, well, let me ask Dr. Chang this question really quick.
Telomeres, that's fine.
Telomere. Dr. Chang, the telomere studies you've
Forbid
conducted, been in animal studies, when will it go to the human side?
I think that's the $1,000,000 question. With more support from the NIA, maybe. I think the first telomerase therapy will probably be conducted on patients with this characteristic congenital, patients with a clear need for telomerase addition. And trials on cells now have shown that if you add telomerase to patients with cells of patients with this characteristic congenital, it restores telomere length. So it's possible that these stem cells could be transfused back to these patients, and they may be cured of this potential disease. Now, hopefully, in the future, we could maybe use telomerase therapy to engineer stem cells to perhaps, in terms of regenerative medicine, to maybe make artificial organs and things like that we could, replace aging organs in that particular fashion. Maybe that will circumvent this cancer problem. That's always this flip side of this.
Do you see clinical
equation.
trials starting soon human clinical trials?
There have been, so there are trials against telomerase. So this anti-telomerase therapy have been in clinical trials, and these are anti-cancer type of therapy using specific oligonucleotides against telomerase. And some of these clinical trials have failed because they have been proven to be too toxic. Obviously, patient stem cells have been compromised. So as to whether you could restore telomerase as an anti-aging therapeutic, that has not been attempted yet.
Very good. All right, so our last question to Dr.
This is a very optimistic group,
Christoch.
I just have to say. These questions reflect a level of optimism that's phenomenal.
Could you say more about how you identify a central person for intervention targeting?
So I use the centrality of the individuals as an illustration. It actually turns out that you wouldn't necessarily want to use central people, but it's a very visually easy concept to show. And actually, our algorithms don't necessarily emphasize central people. But it is mathematically not difficult to identify central people. And basically, central people are people whose friends are more central. And that may sound like the tail, the snake eating its own tail, but actually you can work out that math and you can find individuals who are not only have many friends, but whose friends have many friends. And that's, in a sense, one of the definitions of centrality. The other definition is that central people are on more paths through the network. Of all the paths you could define, and you can define all the paths, there's a finite set through any network, a central person will have more of those paths go through them. So you can use this math to identify them.
Very good. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. They did a terrific job, didn't they?